Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. This week, we look at two controversial issues through a somewhat different lens: urban gentrification and third world sweatshops. In the second half of our show, we're joined by Ben Powell, professor of economics at Texas Tech and author of Out of Poverty, Sweatshops of the Global Economy. Up first, Lance Freeman, Columbia University professor of architecture, planning, and preservation, and author of There Goes the Hood, Views of Gentrification from the Ground Up, joins us to help us better understand who wins and who loses when blighted neighborhoods turn around. Lance, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Lance, exactly what is gentrification and how is it usually characterized?
Gentrification is a process of neighborhood change, and it's usually characterized as a neighborhood that is relatively poor, has experienced a lack of investment, and the process entails higher income, people with higher levels of educational attainment, often commercial investment, other types of investment in the neighborhood, and the neighborhood changing from one that's relatively poor, one that's relatively disadvantaged, to one that's moving in the direction of being more upscale.
And often there are safety and security changes that take place as well.
Right. So that often accompanies also a decline in crime, perhaps. Oftentimes there's a demographic change in terms of racial or ethnic composition, particularly in the United States, from predominantly African American or in some cases Latino to mixed or increasing presence of whites.
Mm-hmm. So what's not to like about a neighborhood improving?
From the vantage point of I think there are two groups that have been critical of gentrification. So, some people living in the neighborhood, whatever the conditions of the neighborhood were prior to gentrification, they might have been satisfied with that, or they may have wanted it to change, but not in the way it's changing with gentrification. So they, like residents of any other neighborhood, may not want their neighborhood to change. And that part is not uncommon. You have neighborhoods in suburbs or affluent neighborhoods or just other types of neighborhoods. When the character changes, oftentimes some people will be upset with that. There's also people who may have been renters in the neighborhood and they may see their rents start to rise. And so even if they like the changes, they might not like that aspect of it because now they have to pay more. And, they may or may not be in a position to be able to afford that. There's also been a lot of academic writing about that. And, I don't know how much you want to get into that, but a lot of the academic critics have been influenced by, sort of a Marxist perspective and sort of seeing gentrification as a manifestation of class warfare in that the upper or elite classes are taking land or taking neighborhoods away from the lower class and working class individuals. And so that way of viewing gentrification, I think, has been very influential within the academy.
And with urban activists.
Yeah, I mean, the urban activists, I think, that, and then also the feeling of people being pushed out of the neighborhood, poor people being pushed out. I think sometimes gentrification is also associated with a change from, if you want to call it, an authentic or idiosyncratic neighborhood characteristics to one that becomes more homogenous and more, like the rest of America. You have chain stores coming in, big box stores, perhaps, things like that. And sometimes people feel that is, these big corporations are remaking the neighborhoods to become sort of sterile places that are indistinguishable from any place else in the United States.
So that's an aesthetic criticism.
Yeah, I think you could say that.
One of the things your work points out is that gentrification and displacement are not exactly the same thing. How so?
In the research I've done, gentrification does typically, by definition, there is some demographic change. In other words, there are people with higher incomes and higher socioeconomic status and perhaps of a different racial ethnic background coming into the neighborhood. So if displacement is defined as people being forced to move, so current residents being forced to move, and I think that's important, how you're defining displacement.
Right.
If it's being defined as the people who are living there and they're forced to move, that does happen sometimes, but not always. And in terms of the way the neighborhood changes, it seems as though, at least in a number of instances, what's happening is that people move all the time in gentrifying neighborhoods and other neighborhoods as well. But what may distinguish the gentrifying neighborhood from another poor neighborhood that's not experiencing gentrification is that the people who come in look different or have more money, whereas in other poorer neighborhoods, they're typically replaced by other people that look like the people that just left. And so the neighborhood looks the same, so to speak, but obviously it's not the same people because people move all the time, people die, whatever. Right. In gentrifying neighborhoods, though, you see it's noticeable. People coming in are different. They maybe have higher incomes. They might be more likely to be white. And so the neighborhood can change that way without
anyone being forced out.
Yeah, or large numbers of people being pushed out.
Well, your work points out, and I was actually surprised by this figure, that turnover in lousy neighborhoods is very high. In a 5-year period, half of typical urban communities move voluntarily anyway?
Right. That is true. There's a lot of churning in these neighborhoods.
Right. So over time, a voluntary displacement is very different than someone has to move because the rent went up.
Right.
So some of the work that you've cited shows that when neighborhoods stabilize and gentrify, turnover or churn actually goes down.
That might be the case. Certainly, homeowners move less frequently, and people with higher incomes tend to move somewhat less frequently as well. I don't know that that's a general finding across all gentrifying neighborhoods, but, the people that tend to move the most frequently are renters, poorer people, younger people as well. And in fact, that these neighborhoods, many of them have high levels of rental stock, and you have younger people moving in, is what allows the neighborhood to change like that in the first place. Because it's, younger people who are often the ones who are, if you want to call them the gentrifiers, they're able to move into these neighborhoods much more easily than a neighborhood that's predominantly homeowners.
In your research, you talk to a lot of long-term residents who stay as a neighborhood gentrifies. As safety improves, as retail improves, as the overall repair level of the homes go up, what do they have to say about their neighborhoods?
Yeah, so I did research for my book, There Goes the Hood, and it was focused on 2 neighborhoods in New York City, and one in Brooklyn, Clinton Hill, which is adjacent to Bedford-Stuyvesant and Fort Greene, and also Harlem in Upper Manhattan. And, I think many people were ambivalent about it. Most people did appreciate the fact that, more stores were opening up in these neighborhoods. And again, you have to remember, it's important to point out the context, and we could talk about that in more depth later on. But these 2 neighborhoods in New York City, like many other inner city neighborhoods, had experienced, significant disinvestment after World War II up until the 1980s. In other words, some of the neighborhoods like in Central Harlem, very few supermarkets. The supermarkets that were there carried, inferior products, very few restaurants that you could go in and sit down and have a meal. So basic services were lacking in the neighborhood. And so that, for example, was something that people appreciate, that there were new amenities that were coming into the neighborhood.
Sure.
Some people also spoke positively about the increasing diversity in the neighborhood. This was not, uniform, but some people felt that in the past their neighborhoods had been stigmatized and that no one would want to live there, and they were kind of almost confined there. So some people thought that the fact that other people now wanted to come into the neighborhood made them feel prouder about their neighborhood because they had been there all along. So some people viewed that positively. There was negative sentiment as well, though. I mentioned previously some people were fearful of housing costs going up. And some people, anytime you have a change, you have people coming in with different backgrounds. So there was conflict about that and about how they felt that public services or in some instances the police were favoring the new residents over the old residents, and sometimes there was a racial overtone to that. People felt that the police were favoring whites over the long term. These neighborhoods were predominantly black and Hispanic, and feeling that the police would sometimes, harass them at the back of the newer residents who were coming in. And so things that perhaps that they had done in the past that they did not think were necessarily harmful, say sitting on the stoop, drinking beer, for example, they didn't see that as something that was hurting anybody. They felt that, new residents came in.
Now the neighbors are complaining.
Yeah, and say, well, this is not acceptable, and call the police. The police would come and harass them. So there was conflicts around those types of, if you want to call them norms, if you will, about what's the appropriate use of public space So that came up. So, there was ambivalence. People appreciated some aspects of it, and some people were more favorable about it. Some people were more negative, and some people had conflicting views, to be honest. So I think it's much more complex than, simple the residents hate gentrification.
Right.
I think what happens sometimes, though, if a neighborhood gentrifies, and some people are opposed to it, I mean, those would naturally be the people who would be more vocal, right? Who might protest or write letters, and people who, maybe feel ambivalent or appreciate some aspect of it probably aren't going to, hold a block party to celebrate gentrification. They'll just, perhaps notice it and maybe comment to their friends or whatever. So I think that is also part of what we're seeing when we hear, people who speak out against gentrification.
So, Lance, let's roll the clock back a little bit. In many cases, gentrification is returning once thriving neighborhoods that fell on hard times back to the way they used to be. How did these neighborhoods fall from grace in the first place?
Okay. I should warn you, I could take a whole show to answer that question, but I'll try to be succinct. After World War II in the United States, and to a lesser extent in other countries as well, new development tended to happen more in suburban regions, particularly in the North and the Midwest. And that was for a number of factors. I mean, for one, the population was growing and there was, more land available there. So, the population after World War II went from like 135 million to 200 million by 1970. So all those people had to go somewhere. But government policy also helped facilitate that movement out of the cities as well through the construction of the interstate highway system, for example, that made it much easier to commute in and around the central cities. On the other hand, the federal government didn't provide that much in the way of subsidy for mass transit, so mass transit tended to wither, relatively speaking. Government policy also subsidized through mortgage insurance programs like the FHA or the VA loans that were made available after World War II. That made it much more affordable for people to buy their own home. And so in many cities, it was, from a financial perspective, it was comparable to rent a home in a central city compared to buying a new home in a suburban region.
So that explains why people moved to the suburbs. Why does that explain why urban areas declined?
Well, so that's one side of it. What was also happening at the time in American cities, you had the great migration of African Americans from the South to cities in the North and the Midwest. And African Americans tended to be poorer than whites that were living there. Many of these neighborhoods also were starved for investment, commercial investment. That's an interesting history for someone to write, but we do know that banks were reluctant to lend in many neighborhoods that were undergoing this type of racial change. So it was more difficult for African Americans to take out mortgages. It would be more difficult for someone to open a business and acquire, financing for that as well. Many of the chains and different types of commercial enterprises were more reluctant to invest in those neighborhoods as well. There were social problems associated with the rapid demographic change in these neighborhoods, the rapid population turnover as well. The list, goes on. There was also some of the policies that the federal government and many local governments undertook to try to reverse the decline backfired in some instances. So, for example, you had urban renewal that in some instances
tore down thriving neighborhoods and put up very dangerous
large public housing
developments. I remember that in New York.
The way the interstate highway system was built in some cities, the highways cut right through neighborhoods, and that also sort of disrupted existing social networks in a way that made crime easier.
There's a whole great book on Robert Moses that people should read about.
Right. That's a great book.
What role does rent control play in the decision by landlords to stop maintaining buildings?
So rent control, I think in its purest form, it gives landlords an incentive if the regulated rent is lower than the market rent or lower than their cost or what have you. It would lead to landlords to disinvest, right, to not maintain the property at a level that you would expect in a competitive market where they would have to compete to try to attract tenants or the like.
I have a number of wealthy friends in New York that still live in rent-controlled or rent-stabilized apartments, and I always found that rather odd. You wrote a paper some time ago suggesting means testing. as a great way to make rent control more efficient and make sure that it served the right people. What became of that, and what was your argument?
The idea was that the rent control is benefiting people who wouldn't necessarily need it, right? If your income is really high, then why do you need rent control? The city has adopted that. I mean, I'm certainly not trying to claim credit for that, but they have adopted a sort of limited means so that if the regulated rent rises above a certain threshold, and off the top of my head, I don't remember what it is, it might be like $2,000 a month or something like that, and your income goes above a certain level, I believe it's $175,000 a year, then the landlord can deregulate the apartment, what's called decontrol, and then we'll return to market rents.
I live in a Boston neighborhood called the South End that was a total no-go zone when I was in college 40 years ago, and now it's one of the most expensive neighborhoods in town. Of course, it's famous for being a gay community, and in fact, the gentrification of the South End is a famous case study in a real estate strategy called Follow the Gays. Is it common for the gay community to pioneer the restoration of blighted neighborhoods?
Yeah, I haven't seen, systematic empirical evidence, but certainly anecdotally that seems to be the case. I think for a couple of reasons. I think this may be less true now, but probably still is to some extent. But anyway, in many inner city neighborhoods, the public schools don't necessarily have good reputations, right? And so families are oftentimes, reluctant to move in those neighborhoods because of the public schools for obvious reasons. Gays have traditionally, although again that might be changed to some extent, have had fewer children, and so that's less of a concern for them.
Right.
There also may be some, and this part I'm somewhat speculating, gays to some extent have been viewed as a marginalized group, an outsider group. Again, that's changing somewhat now, but traditionally that's been the case, and so they may be more willing to venture into a different type of neighborhood or a neighborhood that also houses minorities or another marginalized group. So, they might be the ones that would do that. And I think gays, also oftentimes are associated with being in the creative industries, arts, and what have you, and that brings a sort of hipness or coolness factor.
Restaurants,
to the neighborhood as well.
We have a parade here every year. Everybody turns out to say thanks. I mean, it's really made a big difference. How does gentrification affect urban politicians that have come to rely on votes from particular demographic groups?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I only have basically anecdotal evidence. I think what's happening. Some places you'll see newer politicians coming in and challenging some of the old guard, and I think in some other instances, politicians will try to adapt and try to look at them as just it's another constituency, and how do I target that group and what are their concerns or what have you. I think, in many ways, the concerns at the local level aren't that different among the different groups, right? People want clean streets. People want good schools, less crime. So to the extent that a politician can deliver that, I think you'll see a lot of commonality. And that's sort of a point of where people can come together. And I think, a savvy politician would recognize that and try to zero in on that. But sometimes the identity politics, if you want to call it that, is certainly
driving factor.
That can be affected, to the extent people feel that a person of a certain race or ethnicity should be representing them, or the opposite. So certainly that can come into play. I think that's, certainly hasn't faded away, but it seems like it's in some instances, as in the case of, I forgot the guy's name in Detroit, they elected a white mayor. It seems like it's fading down in some instances.
San Francisco seems to be struggling with an influx of the affluent. It's an affliction you would think many cities would welcome. What's going on out there?
Well, you have the second or maybe third tech boom that's taking place and, generating a lot of wealth. And many people want to live in San Francisco, live and work in San Francisco. So housing is becoming scarce. San Francisco, also has, like most cities, land use regulations that will limit how much the supply could increase. So you put those two factors together, supply that really can't expand much and a big increase in demand as represented by increasing affluence. And the outcome is pretty predictable, right? You're going to have a big increase in prices. And so the big concern is for people who aren't benefiting directly from, the increase in wealth. People, working low-wage jobs, or even probably just, civil service workers, policemen or whatever, teachers, they can't afford to stay in San Francisco. So I think that's what you're seeing, what the concern and antagonisms are about.
As neighborhoods gentrify and people with money move in, you would think there'd be more retail, there'd be more coffee shops, and all of that would produce more employment opportunities for previously urban poor. Do you see any signs of that?
I have seen, I haven't looked at that specifically. I did see one study that showed evidence that does occur, that there are more jobs. So I think the issue, though, becomes is whether or not people can afford to stay in the city despite those new jobs, right? There's a mix, right? I think the way to think about it is, how can you have people generating or creating wealth, particularly in a capitalist society? That's not a bad thing. But what can we do to ameliorate some of the negative side effects, such as people who maybe gain employment, but they don't gain enough that allows them to support themselves or to support a family, for example? How do you deal with that? And, how do you deal with the conflicts that come up in neighborhoods when people with differences live together, right? So I think, the thing to do is to think about, how can we sort of manage it or try to take off some of the harms.
Well, we've actually seen some violence with people throwing rocks at Google buses. So what's the solution?
Well, I mean, that probably feels cathartic to the people throwing the rocks, but that doesn't solve the problem. Yeah. I don't have a magic bullet, but I do think there are some things that can be done. In New York, for example, they've adopted inclusionary zoning, right? So when new development goes up, the developer gets an incentive to build a bigger building if they also include affordable units as part of the development, right? So that is something that produces affordable housing, and it can also encourage new development, right? So you're both increasing the supply of housing, which hopefully would help ease the scarcity of housing for affluent people, all right? Because, I mean, that's what in part drives the gentrification, right? People with more money come into the city. There's not enough luxury condos to go around, so they start looking around in other neighborhoods and pricing other people out. So inclusionary zoning, something like that, I think is something that can help, right? It's not a magic bullet, but it can help. Home ownership for people of limited means, we had a bad experience with that in the last decade because of the way it was practiced. But the positive side potentially could be is that if you own your home in a gentrifying neighborhood,
you enjoy the appreciation. Absolutely.
Yeah. You could either stay or you can sell cash out.
Oh, I've got multimillionaire neighbors here that started out cleaning toilets 40 years ago.
Yeah.
And they just toughed it out through the tough years, and now they're living pretty well. Lance, as an African-American city dweller, how do you see this affecting your community in the years ahead?
Gentrification poses both opportunities and challenges for Black neighborhoods across America, particularly, in older cities. I think the challenge is that some of the political power that was amassed in past decades, may be eroded, particularly if political power is viewed narrowly as having Black politicians to represent you. And there's also this sort of the loss of place and sort of sense of place in many of these neighborhoods. But I think the opportunity, though, is that these neighborhoods could be integrated within the full economy, the full mainstream of these cities. And for many decades, they were sort of isolated as pockets apart. And I think that led to a lot of the decline and the problems that were associated with Black neighborhoods in the latter part of the 20th century. So I think the challenge is to think about how do we turn this in a way that people who have been there for a while can benefit and stay and enjoy the benefits of living fully integrated in a sort of economic way within the larger economy.
In that case, with the increasing integration, it looks like we've come full circle. Lance, thank you so much for joining us today.
Okay, thanks for having me.
That was Lance Freeman, Columbia University professor and author of There Goes the Hood, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Please check out Real Clear Radio on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at Real Clear Frezza. And stop by RealClearMarkets.com, my go-to place for diverse views on political economics. Ahead, Texas Tech professor Ben Powell takes on the daunting task of defending sweatshops and child labor. Stay tuned.